He told her to step back. His voice sharp, cold, loud enough for everyone in the courtroom hallway to hear. She wasn't even facing him, just quietly adjusting the strap of her work bag while waiting outside courtroom 3C. He didn't ask who she was. He didn't check her badge. He didn't even allow her a second to explain. Instead, he walked straight up to her, narrowed his eyes, and said, "This area's for professionals only. You can't be here. Step out, now." She blinked, confused. "I am a professional," she replied, calm but firm, pulling out her ID card halfway. He didn't let her finish. With one abrupt movement, he snatched the badge from her hand, scoffed at it without even looking closely, and shoved it back into her chest. "You think printing something at home makes you official?" he laughed. And just like that, under the eyes of interns, lawyers, and bystanders, she was shoved, yes, physically guided, toward the exit by a white, arrogant police officer who decided, in less than 10 seconds, that she didn't belong there. It didn't matter that she was dressed professionally, that she carried a thick legal binder under her arm, or that her name was on the docket. To him, all that mattered was that she was a young black woman standing too confidently, too silently, in a space that he assumed wasn't meant for her. And no one stopped him. Not the bailiff walking by. Not the court clerk who averted her eyes. Not even the senior lawyer who glanced her way and quickly turned his head as if he hadn't seen what he saw. They let it happen. They all did. What they didn't know, what he didn't know, was that he had just made the biggest mistake of his career. Because minutes later, the woman he humiliated would return. Not with tears. Not with anger. But with power. She wouldn't raise her voice. She wouldn't throw a fit. She wouldn't even mention what had just happened. She would simply walk back into that courthouse. This time, not as someone silently waiting in the hallway, but as the person with the authority to end his career. See, what the officer didn't know was that a high-level federal operation was underway. Corruption within the police force had been under scrutiny for months. Internal Affairs had partnered with the Department of Justice in a covert joint investigation targeting racial profiling and abuse of power inside public institutions. And the woman he threw out? She was the lead on the task force. She was there that morning on assignment. Not to confront him, not to expose him, not yet. Her job was to observe. To take note. To gather evidence. But the second he put his hands on her, the assignment took a turn. And the hunter became the hunted. This wasn't the first time he had done something like this. There were complaints on file. Unprocessed reports. Whispers from junior officers and court staff who had long stopped believing in justice. He thought he was untouchable. And for years, he had been. His methods were always the same: intimidate, humiliate, dominate. Especially when it came to black professionals. Lawyers. Witnesses. Even victims. If they didn't look how he expected, if they didn't speak the way he liked, if they stood too tall, he made it his mission to break them down. But this time, he messed with the wrong one. The moment she returned to that building, escorted not by guards but by 2 federal agents in suits, the air shifted. The hallway where she'd been pushed out minutes earlier went silent as heels echoed against marble floors. Heads turned. Phones slowly lowered. Conversations faded. No one said a word. No one needed to. Her presence alone answered every unspoken question. That badge she carried? It was very real. That authority he mocked? It now held his fate. She walked past him. Didn't flinch. Didn't hesitate. She didn't even look his way. But everyone else did. They watched him, suddenly smaller, quieter, unsure, grip the edge of the security desk he once stood behind so proudly. He tried to play it off. Cleared his throat. Straightened his posture. But the truth was written all over his face. And in that moment, the same people who watched him humiliate her now watched karma arrive, not in rage, but in silence. In power. In dignity. Because what he didn't know was that while he was laughing in her face, she was reviewing the files. The footage. The witness statements. Every step he took that morning had been logged. Every word, every gesture, recorded. By the time she returned, she wasn't just the face of justice, she was the mechanism of it. And this time, she had backup. What happened next left everyone stunned. It wasn't just about one officer. It wasn't even about one act. It was about years of unchecked authority. About a system that looked the other way. And about one woman who refused to stay silent, even when silence would have been safer. She didn't retaliate. She didn't humiliate. She simply held up a mirror. And forced everyone, including him, to see what they'd allowed for far too long. But the real twist? It didn't come with her entrance. It didn't even come with the disciplinary hearing. No, the real twist came later. When a secret about him was exposed, one that changed everything. Something buried deep in old files. A name. A case. A connection. Something no one saw coming. The question is, what did she find? And how far was she willing to go to make sure justice didn't just look good on paper, but actually meant something? Stick around. Because what happens next will make your jaw drop. At Plow of Twist, we stand firmly against all forms of racism, discrimination, and injustice. This channel is a safe space for Black voices, stories, and empowerment. If you've ever felt overlooked, mistreated, or unheard, this story is for you. You matter. Your experiences matter. And your voice deserves to be respected. Now sit back and get ready for a powerful story that will move you, challenge you, and, most importantly, lift you up. Don't forget to subscribe to Plow of Twist for more stories that hit deep and twist hard. Enjoy the story. The morning sun had just begun to peek through the glass panels of the downtown courthouse in Charlotte, North Carolina, casting long streaks of amber light across the polished marble floors. People moved with purpose through the halls, the rhythm of routine justice echoing through conversations, squeaky wheels on evidence carts, and the low hum of anticipation. This building, a blend of neoclassical design and modern efficiency, had become a second home for Nia Freeman, a 34-year-old federal agent whose calm demeanor and sharp intellect were known only to a few select members of her task force. To most, she was invisible. Not because she lacked presence, on the contrary, she walked with quiet power, but because she had learned the art of observing before acting. Watching before speaking. Waiting for the right moment to strike. Nia had grown up in the northern edge of Durham, raised by her grandmother, who used to say, "Don't scream to be seen. Move so well they can't ignore you." It was advice she carried with her like armor, particularly in rooms where she was underestimated simply for being who she was, young, Black, and composed. She had graduated top of her class from Howard University, completed a dual degree in criminal justice and sociology, and joined the Department of Justice at only 25. Since then, she'd built a career focused on dismantling systemic abuse, painfully, deliberately, and sometimes undercover. Her newest assignment was no different. Charlotte's criminal justice system had long raised suspicions within internal affairs. Complaints of racial profiling, courtroom misconduct, and selective enforcement had accumulated slowly, year after year. Nothing ever stuck. Evidence mysteriously went missing. Internal reviews were buried under red tape. But whispers persisted. And so a covert operation was launched, quiet, calculated, built from the inside out. Nia had been placed at the heart of it. Her mission: investigate courthouse behavior, monitor specific officers, and collect undeniable proof of racial bias and abuse of power within one of the state's busiest judicial circuits. That morning, she had arrived early. She dressed precisely, not too flashy, not too plain, wearing a tailored navy suit, natural curls pinned back neatly, and a thin silver chain holding her identification badge beneath her blazer. She carried a black leather binder filled with files, transcripts, and sealed reports. Her cover was simple, legal analyst for a joint oversight initiative. It was vague enough to avoid questions, official enough to avoid suspicion. Or so she thought. What Nia couldn't anticipate was that the very behavior she was sent to investigate would find her before she even stepped into courtroom 3C. The officer stationed outside that room was Officer Raymond Cutler, a 47-year-old white patrolman with a reputation that depended on who you asked. To his colleagues, he was a firm enforcer. To defendants, particularly black ones, he was a nightmare. He wasn't loud or overtly violent. He didn't need to be. His power came from precision, knowing when to speak, when to assert, when to embarrass just enough to remind everyone who was in control. Cutler had been in the force for over 2 decades, never promoted, never demoted, just there. He was the type who slipped through the cracks. No major infractions, but countless minor ones. Accusations that never escalated. A few too many jokes made in bad taste. A few too many people of color mistakenly removed from courtrooms. Every black attorney in the building knew to avoid him. Every clerk of color had a story. But nothing was ever done. Because he did just enough to intimidate without being caught. Until that day. Nia stood near the entrance, reviewing her notes on a bench in the corridor, when Cutler approached her. His eyes scanned her face, then her outfit, then her hands. Something in his gaze lingered. It wasn't concern, it was judgment. He didn't ask her name. He didn't ask why she was there. He saw a black woman in a hallway filled with suits, and his instincts kicked in, not protection, not protocol, but power. A twisted sense of territory. Without hesitation, he barked, "You don't belong here. Let's go." She blinked, stunned. "Excuse me," she asked, unsure if he was speaking to someone behind her. He stepped closer. "I said, let's go. This area's restricted to court personnel. Whatever you're selling or looking for, it's not welcome here." She opened her mouth to respond, to explain, but he cut her off, reaching for the badge around her neck that she hadn't yet pulled out fully. He grabbed it, flipped it once, barely looked at it, and said with a laugh, "Cute. You make this at home?" Gasps echoed from a couple nearby. A young intern froze mid-step. The clerk behind the glass window widened her eyes, then quickly lowered her head. But no one said a word. And Cutler, emboldened by the silence, gestured her toward the exit with a smirk. "Let's not make this a scene. Go." Humiliation flooded her chest like fire. But Nia didn't argue. She didn't resist. She closed her binder slowly, held her head high, and walked out. Her fingers trembled slightly as she descended the courthouse steps. Not from fear, but from control. Every part of her training screamed to stay calm. She wasn't here as a victim. She was here on assignment. And now, she had just been handed the most damning piece of evidence she could have hoped for. Across town, in a quiet government building, 2 agents were already reviewing security footage. Inside her binder were names. Cases. Patterns. Cutler wasn't the only one under watch, but he had just made himself the center of it. Back inside the courthouse, whispers were spreading. People had seen. People had heard. And those who'd kept quiet were now asking themselves if they'd just watched the end of something. Or the beginning. Nia returned to the courthouse 30 minutes later. This time, escorted. She didn't look around for faces of support or acknowledgement. She walked with precision, her badge now displayed clearly, her documents in hand, her posture unshaken. Cutler stood by the same hallway, chatting casually with a fellow officer. The moment he saw her, something in his face shifted, not quite panic, but confusion. She didn't address him. Didn't even glance at him. But the agents beside her did. One whispered something to the other, and a folder changed hands. Cutler tried to stand tall, tried to smirk again, but the energy had changed. He felt it. Everyone did. What Nia had in her possession was enough to warrant an internal review. But what she was building, patiently, thoroughly, was something much bigger. It wasn't about one incident. It wasn't about a hallway or a badge or a personal slight. It was about a culture that allowed people like Cutler to thrive while silencing those they oppressed. She knew that pressing too fast could jeopardize the case. She also knew that silence, weaponized properly, could be louder than any confrontation. The courthouse continued its daily rhythm. Judges called names. Lawyers argued motions. Clerks printed forms. But beneath the surface, something was shifting. Because now, one woman had seen too much, had experienced too much, and had the authority to do something about it. Her presence was no longer quiet. It was strategic. Measured. Calculated. And for Officer Cutler, the countdown had already begun. But what Nia didn't expect, what no one could have predicted, was what would be uncovered next. A buried case. A missing report. A link between Cutler and something far more corrupt than anyone imagined. The question wasn't just whether he would face consequences. It was how deep the rabbit hole went. And whether justice would finally rise where silence had ruled for too long. What exactly did she find, and who else was involved? Stay with me. The truth is just getting started. The following days inside the courthouse unfolded like a slow-burning fuse, quiet, steady, and dangerous. Nia moved with surgical precision, blending in just enough to remain unnoticed by those who didn't know better, while her presence began stirring discomfort among those who did. The building buzzed with its usual rhythm, but something had changed. The air was heavier. The eye contact longer. The laughter more forced. Conversation stopped abruptly when she passed by. Cutler, who once barked across the halls with unchecked confidence, had become noticeably more reserved. He still smirked, still played the part, but his posture was tighter now, his gaze more cautious. He had questions he didn't dare ask aloud. And Nia gave him nothing. Not a look. Not a word. Not a clue. Behind the scenes, however, she was far from silent. In a narrow office tucked into the government annex building across the street, Nia met daily with her assigned team. Marcus Delgado, a seasoned digital forensics analyst, and Tamara Klein, a former prosecutor turned internal affairs investigator, had been pulling threads from different ends. Files that had long been archived or dismissed were brought back into review. They weren't just looking at Cutler anymore, they were mapping patterns across time, location, and personnel. And something was starting to emerge. A string of cases where suspects were thrown out, charges manipulated, or testimonies suppressed, all involving the same officers, same judges, same errors in procedure. And in more than half of them, Cutler was present. Late one evening, Nia leaned against the office window, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the glowing city below. "We're not just chasing a man," she said softly, her voice laced with tension. "We're chasing a culture." Tamara looked up from the documents in front of her and nodded slowly. "And you've already lit the match." Marcus chimed in from his desk, spinning slightly in his chair. "Question is, how far will it burn?" Nia didn't answer. She just stared at the glass. Because the more they found, the more she understood that this wouldn't end with one disciplinary hearing or one televised apology. No. What was coming would shake the whole foundation, and she needed to be ready. Back inside the courthouse, cracks began to show. Junior staff started whispering. An assistant DA approached Nia in the hallway one morning and asked quietly if they could talk, somewhere private. She was young, maybe late 20s, with nervous hands and tired eyes. In the break room, she hesitated before speaking, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's done this before," she said. "I've seen it. I've filed reports. Nothing ever stuck. They said it was my word against his." Nia listened silently, offering no promise but plenty of space. The woman looked relieved just to be heard. Days later, a court clerk slid a sealed envelope across a cafe table downtown, eyes darting around nervously. Inside was a list, dates, names, and case numbers. The handwriting was messy but desperate, like someone who had been holding secrets for too long. At the bottom of the page, one name was circled twice. Nia froze. It was a name she hadn't seen in years. A name that brought memories of a case she thought had long been buried. And yet here it was, tied to Cutler. That's when the storm inside her began to grow. In the middle of it all, Cutler was beginning to unravel. He tried to assert his usual dominance, but it didn't land the same. He'd corner coworkers with jokes meant to be funny, but no one laughed. He lingered longer than necessary outside courtroom doors, as if watching for something, or someone. And every so often, he would glance at Nia from a distance, his jaw tightening when she spoke with judges, lawyers, or agents in hushed, focused tones. One afternoon, he confronted her. Not aggressively, just enough to feel her out. "You know, some people come into this place thinking they're gonna fix the world," he said, his voice low and casual, leaning against a doorway. Nia didn't stop walking. "Maybe the world doesn't need fixing," she replied, not looking at him. "Maybe it just needs better people." His smirk faltered. "Careful. Places like this chew people up, even the ones who think they're smarter than the system." She turned slightly, eyes calm, voice even. "Maybe. Or maybe the system is finally choking on the wrong person." He didn't answer. Just stared. Because for the first time, he didn't know if he was the predator or the prey. As the investigation deepened, more names surfaced, officers, clerks, attorneys, all tied to misconduct, some directly, others by silence. Nia's team built timelines, mapped connections, traced behaviors. The case was no longer about proving abuse. It was about proving conspiracy. And Cutler, once just a small piece of the puzzle, now sat at the center of something much larger, whether he realized it or not. And then came the file. It arrived late one night, slipped under the door of the annex office. No return address. Just a thick manila folder sealed with tape. Inside were photocopies, old court transcripts, complaint forms, and one torn photograph of a young man in handcuffs, eyes terrified, bruised, bleeding. Nia felt her throat tighten. She remembered that face. She remembered that case. She remembered how it vanished from the system with no trace. She had been an intern then, just starting, with no voice, no power, and no way to stop what happened. But now she had both. And that boy's case was the thread that could unravel everything. At the next task force meeting, she laid the photo on the table and looked around. He was 17, she said. Falsely accused, badly beaten, case disappeared. And Cutler was lead on the arrest. Tamara leaned forward, eyes wide. This could change everything. Marcus nodded. Especially if the suppression came from upstairs. Nia didn't respond right away. She just stared at the photo. Not because of the boy, but because of the signature on the report. A name she knew all too well. A name she never expected to resurface. Someone powerful. Someone untouchable. Until now. Outside, the city moved like any other day. Buses rolled by. Suits crossed intersections. Coffee shops hummed with idle talk. But inside the courthouse and within the files building across from it, a reckoning was building, slow, silent, and inevitable. Cutler could feel it in the way people looked at him. In the way conversations quieted when he entered a room. In the way Nia passed him with an unreadable expression that was somehow louder than any accusation. He started pushing back. Asking around. Calling in favors. Rumors reached him that meetings were happening without him. That his name had been flagged. That his personnel file was being reviewed at a higher level. One morning, he slammed his locker shut with so much force it echoed down the hall. An officer nearby jumped. "They're setting me up," Cutler snapped. "You'll see. I'm not going down for this." But his voice cracked ever so slightly at the end, betraying fear. Meanwhile, Nia was preparing the final pieces. Her next steps weren't just procedural, they were personal. That 17-year-old boy had been her cousin. The case that disappeared changed her entire trajectory. It had sent her down this path. And now, all these years later, the man responsible for destroying a family, had handed her the match to burn the whole house down. But she had to move carefully. This wasn't about revenge. It was about justice. She needed the timing to be perfect. The evidence to be airtight. The exposure to be undeniable. Because once the next move was made, there would be no turning back. And so she waited. She listened. She planned. Because the next time she walked into that courtroom, she wouldn't just be a name on a badge. She would be the storm they never saw coming. But what happens when the past and the present collide in front of a city that spent years pretending not to see? That answer is coming. And it will shake everyone to the core. The morning felt unusually quiet inside the courthouse. Not just the kind of quiet that comes with early hours, but a dense, anticipatory silence that seemed to cling to the walls. Something about the air felt thicker, slower, as if time itself knew what was about to unfold. Nia walked through the double-glass doors with deliberate steps, her badge clipped in full view, her posture steady but unreadable. She was dressed in black, sleek, tailored, and commanding, like someone attending a funeral, but not mourning. Her heels clicked across the polished floors like a countdown, each step echoing off the walls as heads slowly began to turn. People noticed her. People moved. Clerks paused, eyes following her path. Attorneys glanced over their papers. The usual rhythm of justice had changed, because everyone had heard whispers. They just didn't know what was about to happen. Yet. Cutler stood near the security checkpoint, sipping from a paper cup, his face tight with irritation masked as indifference. His uniform still crisp, but his stance no longer carried the arrogance it once did. The rumor mill had reached him in fragments, meetings he wasn't invited to, folders that passed hands too quickly, glances that lingered a little too long. He had tried to act like it didn't get to him. Tried to keep his voice steady, his presence loud. But beneath that badge and forced confidence was a man unraveling. And when he saw Nia walking toward the internal courtroom reserved for high-level hearings, escorted by 2 federal agents in plain suits, he knew. His hand clenched around his cup until it buckled. He followed her path without realizing he had moved. Like instinct. Like fear. Inside, the hearing room was already set. A long mahogany table stretched across the space, microphones prepared, a panel of 3 officials seated at the far end with folders stacked neatly before them. Tamara sat to the side, arms crossed, eyes focused. Marcus stood near the projector screen, organizing digital files. And in the center of it all, at the head of the table, stood a seat reserved for Nia. But before she sat, she turned slowly toward the entrance. Cutler had stopped in the doorway, stunned, blinking at the sight of the setup. For a second, he looked around, like maybe this wasn't for him. Like maybe he could turn back. But the look in her eyes rooted him to the spot. She didn't speak. Just nodded to the bailiff. "Officer Raymond Cutler, you're required to step forward." His voice cracked slightly, almost defensively. "What is this?" "I wasn't told about any, you are now," the bailiff said. He hesitated, chest rising and falling faster now. But slowly, he moved forward, every step taking something out of him. He sat opposite Nia, unsure where to look. His hands fidgeted with the hem of his sleeves. For the first time in years, he wasn't the one controlling the room. The lead investigator opened the folder and began to read. Charges of professional misconduct. Evidence of racial bias. Procedural manipulation. Unlawful physical engagement. The list grew, but it wasn't loud. It was methodical. Precise. Clinical. Cutler tried to interrupt. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. "You're taking one moment out of context," Nia's voice cut through him like glass. "This is not about one moment." Everyone turned. She wasn't loud. She didn't raise her voice. But the weight in her words settled in the room like thunder before the rain. This is about years of behavior. Patterns. Victims who were never heard. Stories that were never told. And people like you who thought no one was watching. He scoffed, leaning back. People like me? Yes, she replied. People who hold authority like a weapon. Who use their badge not to protect, but to filter out who they think deserves justice. He shook his head, trying to muster a smirk, but it faltered. This is personal for you, isn't it? Her eyes didn't flinch. You made it personal the moment you laid hands on me. Silence spread again. Heavy. Unforgiving. The projector screen came to life, displaying incident after incident. Footage from hallway cameras. Audio from complaints that had gone uninvestigated. A photo of her cousin, his bruised face staring back at the room like a ghost from a system that had tried to erase him. Cutler's eyes flickered. For a second, just one, his posture broke. He knew that name. He knew that case. But he didn't speak. Nia stood. You want to know why I'm here, she said, looking directly at him now. Because 12 years ago, you arrested a kid named Deshaun Freeman. You beat him unconscious. You falsified the police report. And you made sure the evidence vanished before it ever saw a courtroom. His face paled. I was fresh out of college when I read the file, she continued. I knew something was wrong. I tried to raise it. They told me I didn't understand how things worked. Cutler's voice was barely audible. I don't even remember that case. Of course you don't, she said. But I do. Because he was my cousin. And your report, your lies, destroyed our family. She didn't cry. Her voice didn't shake. That was what made it so much harder to ignore. The lead official leaned forward. Officer Cutler, do you wish to respond? He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. His hand gripped the edge of the table. I was doing my job, he said finally, but even he didn't believe it. You were abusing your power, Tamara cut in. And the system let you. The hearing continued. Witnesses came in. Statements were read. More files were displayed. And with every passing minute, the myth of Officer Cutler dissolved. He wasn't a misunderstood enforcer. He wasn't a victim of circumstance. He was a man who believed the system would always protect him. Until it didn't. Outside the hearing room, courthouse staff gathered near the hallway, pretending to sip coffee, pretending to read papers. But everyone knew. Everyone waited. Because something irreversible was happening behind that door. And by the time the final statement was made, by the time the panel dismissed the room for deliberation, the atmosphere had shifted permanently. Nia walked past Cutler without looking back. Her footsteps no longer sounded like a countdown, they sounded like a verdict. But what she didn't know yet, what not even the task force had uncovered completely, was that Cutler's file wasn't the only one that would explode under scrutiny. A hidden connection was about to emerge. One that would turn the entire investigation upside down. And force Nia to make a choice no one expected. The panel reconvened after nearly an hour, but it felt like a lifetime. Nia sat motionless, her fingers laced together on the table in front of her, her face a calm, unreadable surface masking the storm within. Cutler, on the other side, had grown visibly restless. His once straight posture had collapsed into a nervous hunch, eyes darting between the door, the panel, and the floor beneath him. He kept wiping his hands on his uniform pants, his breath short, uneven. Every sound in the room, every shuffled paper, every cough, every creak of a chair, made him flinch slightly. This wasn't just about losing a badge anymore. He could feel it. There was something more. Something coming he hadn't prepared for. The lead official cleared her throat, straightening the microphone in front of her. Her voice was calm but final. This panel has reviewed the presented evidence and finds sufficient cause to proceed with formal disciplinary action against Officer Raymond Cutler for repeated instances of misconduct, excessive force, and abuse of authority. A full internal investigation will now be launched, including all past cases associated with Officer Cutler's service record. During this period, Officer Cutler is to be placed on immediate administrative leave without pay. The words hit like a bullet. Cutler's lips parted slightly, like he was about to speak, but nothing came out. No deflection. No protest. Only silence. Nia didn't move. She didn't look at him. Her gaze remained on the panel, focused and unwavering. She hadn't come for revenge. She came for accountability. And now, the first domino had fallen. But just as the room began to shift, just as people started gathering their papers and rising from their chairs, Tamara raised a hand gently and said, "Before we adjourn, Agent Freeman, there's one more matter you should be made aware of." Nia turned to her slowly, surprised by the shift in tone. Tamara's expression was different now, more guarded, as though she were carefully choosing each word before letting it land. Tamara opened a folder that hadn't yet been introduced, slid a page forward, and met Nia's eyes. "This came in from the FBI this morning. Someone anonymous flagged a document related to Deshawn's arrest all those years ago. A file that was sealed. A file we weren't supposed to see." Nia's body stiffened. Her chest tightened, but she kept her face still. "What kind of file?" she asked quietly. Tamara took a slow breath. "A phone call transcript. The night of the arrest. Someone from inside the department called the judge directly. Pressured them to sign off on a rushed plea deal. Said the arrest would be cleaned up if it moved quickly. The transcript shows the caller's ID. It wasn't Cutler." The air shifted again. Nia blinked, trying to process. Who was it? Tamara didn't speak. She just slid the paper across the table, eyes watching Nia closely. Nia read the name once. Then again. Her jaw tightened. Her heart pounded. For a moment, everything in the room blurred. Because the name written on that page, the man who called the judge to protect a dirty arrest, to erase her cousin's truth, was someone she never expected to see listed in this investigation. It was Deputy Chief Harold Connors. Connors, the same man who mentored her early in her DOJ career. The man who wrote her letters of recommendation. Who sat across from her family during Deshawn's funeral and whispered, "We'll get justice someday." The same man who told her, "You belong here," when she doubted herself. The same man who, all along, had buried the truth. Cutler turned his head at the sound of silence, watching Nia's face change. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. But something in her eyes cracked. He leaned forward slowly. "Wait. You didn't know?" he said, voice trembling. "You thought I acted alone." Nia turned to him. Her voice was low, steady, but layered with something new, betrayal. "You followed orders." Cutler hesitated, then nodded once. "I did what I was told. I kept my mouth shut. I took the heat. That night. Connors said it needed to go away. Fast. He told me to make the arrest, rough if necessary, and he'd take care of the paperwork. Said the kid matched a description. Didn't even care if it stuck. Just wanted him out of the system. Nia stared at him. The ground beneath her felt like it was tilting. Everything she had believed, the years of building this case, the righteous sense of justice, had been guided by a man who'd played both sides. A man who built her confidence while breaking her family behind closed doors. The lead official spoke again. Agent Freeman will be escalating this discovery to the Attorney General. Given the gravity of the new evidence, Connors will be placed under immediate review. But this changes the scope of your investigation. Nia nodded slowly, but her mind was spinning. Connors wasn't just part of the system, he was the system. He had navigated every level, mentored young black professionals, hosted diversity panels, built a reputation as a progressive leader. And beneath it all, he was protecting corruption. Sanitizing injustice under the guise of reform. Her hands clenched into fists on the table. Cutler watched her closely now, voice lower. You wanted to believe it was just me. That I was the monster. But I was a foot soldier. He built the machine. Nia stood slowly, gathering her files. And you still chose to pull the trigger. Cutler didn't argue. He just dropped his gaze. Outside the courtroom, reporters had begun gathering. News had leaked. Phones buzzed. Officers shifted uneasily in corners. No one knew exactly what had been said inside, but they felt the ripple. Something massive had broken. Nia stepped into the hallway, blinking against the flash of cameras, but kept walking. She didn't stop. Didn't look at anyone. Her mind wasn't on the press. It was on the man sitting 3 floors above her office, sipping coffee, waiting for a meeting he didn't know would be his last. Connors. She entered the elevator alone. Pressed the button for the 6th floor. Watched the numbers rise. Her reflection in the mirrored walls was calm, but her heart was roaring. This wasn't just about Cutler anymore. This wasn't just about Deshawn. This was about everyone Connors had silenced while smiling in their faces. Every kid labeled as a threat. Every officer protected. Every report rewritten. When the doors opened, the hallway was empty. Quiet. She walked down the corridor, each step harder than the last. Her hand hovered near the handle of Connor's office. For a brief second, she paused. Remembered his voice. Remembered his praise. Remembered how he'd looked at her with pride, and lies. Then she knocked once and opened the door. He looked up from his desk, surprised. Smiled faintly. Agent Freeman, he said, standing. I didn't know you were. She dropped the file on his desk. His smile faded. He opened it. Read the page. His face changed. What do you want to say? She asked, her voice like steel wrapped in sorrow. Connors didn't sit. He looked up slowly, shame and calculation wrestling in his eyes. I did what I had to do, he said. You know how it was back then. Nia shook her head, eyes burning. No. I know what you chose to do. And who you chose to sacrifice. He tried to defend himself. Tried to shift blame. But every word he spoke felt like ash. And in that moment, he knew, she wasn't the girl he once mentored. She wasn't the quiet intern anymore. She was the reckoning. And she had just begun. The silence that followed Connor's confession wasn't quiet, it was deafening. It buzzed in the air like electricity, raw and unresolved, stretching between them and the sterile office lined with plaques and polished wood. Nia stood perfectly still, staring at the man who, for years, had been both a mentor and a mirror, reflecting back to her an image of success and belonging, one that now felt like a manufactured illusion. Connor's shoulders had dropped, but not from surrender, more like a slow collapse under the weight of his own unraveling image. His eyes searched her face, maybe for mercy, maybe for understanding, but found neither. What he saw was something harder to process, clarity, the kind that left no room for excuse or negotiation. And still, she hadn't said a word. Behind the calm that masked her expression, Nia's thoughts raced. The implications of what Connors had done didn't stop with Deshawn, or even Cutler. This was about decades of cases built on manipulation, arrests framed for convenience, lives discarded in the name of efficiency and order. He hadn't just betrayed her, he had betrayed the entire concept of justice while pretending to champion it. And now, with the truth exposed, a new question began to form, slow and treacherous. What does real justice look like when it threatens to tear down everything you once believed in? Connors finally broke the silence. His voice was low, almost gentle. If this goes public, the department could collapse. Do you understand that? Everything we've built, the trust, the initiatives, the reforms, it'll all be destroyed. Nia's eyes narrowed, and her words cut in sharply. What we built was a lie. And the people paying the price were never you. They were kids like my cousin. Lawyers denied access. Mothers silenced. Entire communities written off as threats so you could keep your hands clean and your conscience intact. Her voice trembled, not from weakness, but from rage held back for too long. You built your name on the backs of the very people you claimed to uplift. He didn't try to deny it. He just exhaled deeply, the weight of his own history folding him down into his chair. You think exposing this will fix it all? He asked, staring at the floor now. You think one report, one press conference will undo decades of rot? She stepped forward, placing her hand on the folder she had dropped moments before. No, she said. But it's a start. And I don't care how much of this place burns, as long as the truth finally breathes. Downstairs, the energy in the building had shifted entirely. Officers whispered in corners, administrators typed without looking up from their screens, and the front desk phone rang non-stop as the media caught wind of something big breaking. Nia left Connor's office without waiting for a response, her heels striking each floor tile with controlled fury. She made her way back to the 6th floor task force office, where Marcus and Tamara were huddled around the monitor, their expressions tight and unreadable. They looked up as she entered, and without asking, Tamara pushed a file toward her. The AG's office just approved full release of the investigation findings. They want you to lead the press briefing. It's going national, she said. But there's more, Marcus added, eyes fixed on the screen. Connors isn't the only one. We're getting names. Judges, clerks, probation officers. Patterns we missed. This goes deeper than we thought. The gravity in the room thickened. Nia reached for the file but paused, her hand hovering over the pages. For a brief moment, doubt tried to crawl into her chest. Not about the facts, they were solid, but about what came next. What if the system didn't want to be fixed? What if exposing everything only buried it deeper under spin and damage control? And worse, what if she became the face of it all? The woman who brought down a city's justice infrastructure. Tamara seemed to sense the hesitation and walked over quietly. You don't have to carry it alone, she said. We'll back you. Whatever happens next, it's not just on your shoulders. Nia nodded, her throat tight. But it started with my family. With Deshawn. I need to be the one to say it. She gathered the files, inhaled deeply, and turned toward the window, where sunlight now poured through like an accusation too bright to ignore. That afternoon, the courthouse held its breath. The press conference was moved to the large public hall on the 2nd floor, the same one where graduation ceremonies and retirement farewells were often held. Now, the rows of chairs were filled with reporters, attorneys, families, and a community desperate for something real. As Nia stepped up to the podium, the hum of voices silenced instantly. She stood in front of the microphones, the official DOJ seal behind her, a thick folder under her arm. Cameras clicked. Pens waited. And all eyes fixed on her. She began slowly, her voice steady. My name is Agent Nia Freeman. I'm a lead investigator on a federal inquiry into systemic misconduct and corruption within the Charlotte criminal justice system. She paused. The room leaned forward. What we've uncovered over the last 3 months is more than a pattern. It's a practice, one designed to protect the powerful, silence the vulnerable, and distort the very foundation of our courts. She went on to list the confirmed findings. Racially biased arrests. Fabricated police reports. Unlawful surveillance. Prosecutorial coercion. And the names. Cutler. Connors. Judges who'd fast-tracked plea deals without due process. Clerks who'd shredded evidence. Every detail released to the public in real time. No redactions. No spin. People didn't cheer. They didn't clap. They sat in stunned silence, absorbing the scale of what they had ignored, accepted, or feared for so long. Later that evening, as the story flooded every screen and newsfeed in the region, Connors was placed on administrative leave pending criminal investigation. Cutler's badge was officially stripped. And more subpoenas were issued before midnight. But the fallout was only beginning. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse steps. Community leaders held impromptu vigils. Victims of past cases came forward with new evidence, eager to finally be heard. The city was cracking open, not in chaos, but in awakening. Back at the annex office, Nia sat alone, the soft glow of a desk lamp casting long shadows across the files still stacked high around her. Tamara had gone home. Marcus was downstairs in a meeting. For the first time in days, there was silence. Real silence. And in it, the weight of what had happened finally settled. She opened Deshawn's photo and stared into his young face, not with sadness, but with resolve. He would never come back. Nothing could undo what had been done. But the silence that followed his death would no longer protect the guilty. It would roar. It would name names. It would change something, maybe not everything, but enough to matter. Then the phone rang. She answered on instinct, her voice quiet. Freeman. A pause. A voice on the other end she didn't recognize. I saw the conference, the man said. I was part of that unit. Years ago. I have more. Files. Audio. I kept them. You need to see this. Nia sat upright, her pulse rising again. Why now? She asked. Another pause. Then, because I was afraid. But you just gave us all a reason not to be. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The fight wasn't over. It was only changing shape. And somewhere, just out of sight, justice was still knocking, harder now, louder, unstoppable. The office smelled faintly of burnt coffee and old paper as Nia sat back down, her mind racing with what that anonymous caller had just said. The weight of everything she had set in motion pressed against her chest, not with regret, but with intensity, with the awareness that every step forward now could unravel more than she'd imagined. She had always known the system was broken, but now, with each new witness, each fresh folder passed under locked doors or slid across dimly lit cafes, it was becoming more and more clear, this wasn't about isolated corruption. It was an architecture of silence. A culture of manipulation. And she was standing at its crumbling foundation with only a flashlight and the truth. Tamara returned just before midnight, still in her heels, blazer folded over her arm, dark circles under her eyes. She dropped a folder on Nia's desk with a sigh and pulled her chair close. I just got off a call with the AG, she said, voice hoarse. They're fast-tracking the grand jury proceedings. There's talk of federal indictments. But there's also pushback. Nia didn't look up. From who? Tamara rubbed her temples. Local leadership. Judges. People afraid this is going to destroy public confidence in the courts. Nia's voice was quiet but sharp. Good. Maybe then they'll rebuild it with people who actually deserve that confidence. Tamara leaned in, voice softer now. That's not all. The caller. The one who reached out to you tonight. We traced the number. He used to be a technician in the records division. Fired 8 years ago under suspicious circumstances. He was responsible for archiving court audio, before it all went digital. He claims he has backups. Originals. Conversations between officers and judges that were never meant to be heard again. Nia's eyes finally lifted, the exhaustion behind them replaced by something colder. And he's willing to give it up. Tamara nodded. He's scared. But he said you're the reason he's talking. That after watching you, he didn't want to stay silent anymore. Nia stood slowly, the file still in her hands. Set a meeting. Quietly. No press. No agencies. Just us. If he has what he says he does, this could blow the entire network wide open. 2 nights later, under the flickering light of a closed-down diner on the edge of town, Nia and Tamara sat in a booth across from a man who looked like he hadn't slept in years. His hands trembled as he slid a hard drive across the table. I never planned to keep it, he whispered. I just couldn't delete it. I thought, maybe one day someone would need to know. Nia reached for it gently. Why now? He looked up, his eyes red-rimmed and wet. Because you're the first one who didn't blink when it got ugly. Back at the office, the hard drive revealed what they never expected. Dozens of files. Audio recordings from closed-door meetings, hallway conversations caught by accident, even late-night phone calls between officers and court officials. But one file stopped Nia cold. It was dated the night of Deshawn's arrest. In it, Connor's voice was unmistakable. Calm. Strategic. Cold. He's just another number, he said. Push it through. No one's going to dig. And if they do, we'll say it was a judgment call. Then, the voice on the other end, the judge, asked, what if someone finds the footage? Connors replied, then we'll lose the footage. Nia hit pause. The room was silent except for the hum of the computer. Marcus stood behind her, speechless. Tamara slowly lowered her hand from her mouth. No one spoke for a long time. The next morning, federal agents arrived at Connor's home. News crews hovered like vultures, circling slow, waiting for confirmation. And when the footage finally aired, grainy courtroom hallways, muffled voices, laughing at victims, plotting shortcuts, everything shifted. This wasn't just a scandal. This was a reckoning. Entire departments were suspended. Cases reopened. Defendants contacted. Families who had long been told to move on suddenly found themselves staring at the possibility of real accountability. Inside the courthouse, the environment was almost unrecognizable. Some officers walked the halls with their heads down. Others, who had silently rooted for change, now stepped forward with stories of their own. Lawyers who once shrugged at complaints were now offering pro bono assistance to the wrongly convicted. The culture that once fed off fear now pulsed with hesitation, uncertainty, and a growing hope. One afternoon, as Nia was leaving a long meeting with federal prosecutors, she passed by a group of interns huddled near the elevators. They went quiet as she approached, then one of them, a young black woman with tight braids and wide, determined eyes, stepped forward. Agent Freeman, she said, nervous but bold. I just wanted to say thank you. My brother was one of the kids in that list. You're the reason we're getting a second chance. Nia didn't speak for a moment. She just nodded slowly, her voice gentle. Don't thank me. Thank the ones who didn't stop fighting. That night, she returned home for the first time in days. Her apartment was still, untouched since the investigation exploded. She poured herself a glass of water, sat on the edge of her bed, and stared at the wall. For all the victories, all the headlines, she felt something deeper settling inside her. A quiet ache. Justice had been served, but it hadn't come clean. It came jagged. Messy. Complicated. She had exposed the truth, yes, but it came with losses she'd never reclaim. Her cousin's name was cleared, but his life remained stolen. The system was cracked open, but not yet rebuilt. And she knew the hardest part was just beginning. The phone rang again. This time, it was the mayor's office. They wanted her to speak at a city forum, public discussion about the future of law enforcement. Reform policies. Inclusion initiatives. Community healing. She said yes without hesitation. Not because she wanted the spotlight. But because silence had cost too much. And now, her voice wasn't just hers, it carried thousands more behind it. In the days that followed, she attended funerals for victims whose cases were reopened too late. She visited schools, where students asked her what justice really looked like. She testified before a national committee. And each time she spoke, she didn't promise easy answers. She told the truth, even when it stung. Even when it exposed her pain. And people listened. But she still had one visit left. One she had postponed. She drove alone to a small cemetery on the edge of Durham. The grass was damp from a recent rain, and the sky hung heavy with gray. She knelt by Deshawn's grave, her fingers brushing over the name etched in stone. For a long time, she said nothing. Then, quietly, she spoke. You weren't just a case. You weren't just a report they buried. You mattered. And I didn't stop until they knew that. Her voice cracked, but she let it. Let the emotion bleed through. Because it was real. Because the pain had never been about vengeance, it had been about value. His value. Their value. She stood slowly, the wind brushing her cheek like a whisper. And as she walked back to her car, the sky began to break open, not in storm, but in light. The reckoning was far from over. But now, the truth had a voice. And its name was justice. Months passed, but the ripple of what had happened in Charlotte continued to expand far beyond the courthouse walls. The hearings turned into federal cases, and soon, the headlines that once only dominated local news began leading national broadcasts. Raymond Cutler, once seen as a permanent fixture of courthouse authority, stood trial for obstruction of justice, civil rights violations, and falsification of police reports. With a mountain of evidence built against him and multiple testimonies exposing his long trail of abuse, he was sentenced to 10 years in federal prison. No cameras were allowed during sentencing, but those who sat in the courtroom said he didn't look angry, he looked hollow. As if for the first time, he realized that power isn't real when it's built on fear and silence. Deputy Chief Connors wasn't as easily contained. His political ties and reputation made the path to prosecution more difficult. But what he couldn't hide from was the recorded evidence, the tapes, the transcripts, the sealed files that had now become part of public record. When he resigned, he did it quietly, without statement, slipping out of public view. But Nia knew the truth had already done what no policy could, it dismantled the legacy he tried to build on deception. His face, once proudly displayed at forums and community events, was now a symbol of betrayal. And while he avoided a prison sentence, he would spend the rest of his life in the shadow of what he helped cover up. For him, power had been a tool of preservation. But the truth proved stronger. The courthouse, once a stage for whispered injustices, began to transform. Leadership shifted. Diversity training became mandatory, but not as a formality, as a requirement for employment. New hires were brought in with community experience and proven accountability. Surveillance footage protocols were overhauled. Civilian oversight committees were granted real authority. And most importantly, past convictions tied to Cutler and Connors were formally reviewed, leading to dozens of case dismissals, expungements, and reparations. Families who once sat in courtrooms with no hope now walked out with legal apologies and, in some cases, the freedom of loved ones finally recognized as wrongfully convicted. As for Nia, her life would never return to what it was before. But not because she had lost something, because she had claimed something larger than herself. After everything unfolded, she was offered a promotion to lead the Civil Rights Integrity Division at a national level. It wasn't just a title. It was a call. A mission. She accepted the role not with fanfare, but with the same quiet intensity that had carried her through every moment of this fight. She moved to Washington, D.C., her new office overlooking the Capitol, not as a symbol of power, but as a reminder of the system she now had a hand in shaping from the inside. Despite the accolades, interviews, and formal recognition, Nia remained grounded in one truth: justice isn't a destination, it's a constant act of choice. She continued visiting schools and community centers, holding space for young black students who needed to see someone who looked like them stand in rooms of power without apology. She created a mentorship program in her cousin Deshawn's name, helping young people navigate law, policy, and resistance with knowledge as their weapon. Each time a letter arrived from a mother whose child had been freed because of her work, she read it slowly, alone, giving each word the weight it deserved. Tamara stayed in Charlotte, taking over a leadership role in the regional office. She became the force that held new agents to the highest standard, often quoting Nia in meetings without admitting it. Marcus, now a lead strategist on data and equity audits, began developing software that tracked racial disparities in real time, giving communities the tools to demand change through undeniable evidence. Their bond remained unshakable, a trio forged in truth, committed to never letting another Deshawn fall through the cracks. But perhaps the most unexpected shift came from within the city itself. The same people who once turned away now stood up. Communities once silenced by fear began organizing. Youth groups, legal aid clinics, and neighborhood watch programs formed coalitions focused not just on punishment, but prevention. For the first time in a long time, the people closest to the pain were at the center of the solution. And Nia, on one quiet evening months later, stood once again outside the same courthouse where it had all begun. This time, not with a badge or a file. Just herself. She looked at the doors, at the marble steps that once echoed her humiliation, and felt no anger. Just clarity. She knew now that the most powerful revenge wasn't humiliation or retribution. It was transformation. The system hadn't expected her to survive, let alone rebuild it. But she had. On her terms. With truth. With grace. With fire. Now I want to leave you with this. How many systems do we move through every day, assuming they're unchangeable? How many injustices do we accept because the cost of speaking feels too high? Nia's story is not just about punishment, it's about what it takes to reclaim something that was never meant to be fair, and demand that it become something better. Something honest. Something just. And maybe the most powerful question we can ask ourselves is, what would we do if the system turned on us, and we had the power to change it? Would we stay silent? Or would we rise? If this story moved you, if it made you think, feel, question, then drop your thoughts in the comments. What part hit you the hardest? Who did you relate to? And most importantly, what does justice mean to you? And don't forget, subscribe to Tales of Twist for more powerful, emotional stories that challenge the way we see the world. Your support helps us keep telling the truths that need to be heard. Until next time. Keep your eyes open. Keep your voice loud. And never stop believing in the power of the truth.